Sounds to me like it's quite a good time to be a scammer.
Yeah, possibly, unless you're caught, and then it's really, really terrible.
Welcome to History's Greatest Scandals. In this series, we're uncovering the secrets of the Georgian era. And joining me to explore the highs and lows of British society in the 18th and early 19th centuries is Professor Hannah Greig, a historian, author, and a historical consultant on dramas including Poldark, The Favourite, and Bridgerton. We'll be following on the trail of forgers, uncovering illicit liaisons, meeting cross-dressing celebrity spies, and getting involved in some high-stakes gambling, as we search out some of the biggest scandals of the day and explore what they can reveal about the Georgian age.
So, Ellie, do you like a scammer story?
Well, okay, it's not fashionable, but I have to admit I do. And I feel like there's so many of them around these days. Podcasts, documentaries. I mean, usually these days they're about fake billionaires or fake tech entrepreneurs, though, aren't they?
They are, but our fascination with scammers has quite a long history, and we can find some interesting cases in the Georgian period. And they were just as intrigued by real-life scams as we are, as we're going to discuss today. So today's story is a sensational courtroom drama featuring a whole gang of untrustworthy characters. So it includes a kind of seemingly genteel lady, but she has a secret past, possibly. An apothecary who is possibly an upstanding member of the community, but is he actually very deceptive? And he has a fast-living, gambling, dangerous twin brother.
Twins and dark histories. Let's get into it.
So we're in London, it's 1775, and the banker Henry Drummond is at work at his family's bank. A man comes, a local apothecary called Robert Perreaus, who's asking to borrow a very significant amount of money. It's about £5,000.
A lot of money today, but presumably even more then.
It's a huge amount of money then. I mean, it's sort of buy an estate amount of money, basically. So, Drummond isn't just going to hand this over. So to secure the loan, Robert Perreaus says he has a bond for even more money, £7,500, which has been signed and secured effectively by a man who's pretty well known in the City of London called William Adair.
So before we go any further, what does he mean by a bond? What is that?
So a bond is a piece of paper that basically functions within the London and British economy as a form of trust. So it's a way of guaranteeing a loan. In a similar way today, we might possibly have a guarantor for a big loan for a tenancy agreement. So if there's a suspicion that your credit rating means that you might not meet a payment, you have someone else who's trustworthy, who's financially secure, who can guarantee that loan for you. So if you fail to make the payment, they will step up. And that's how a bond operates in 18th century London as well. So Robert Perreaus is saying that William Adair will meet the debt if he fails.
Okay, so we've got Robert. He wants to borrow £5,000 and he's saying this man, this so-called William Adair, he will cover the debt to Drummond's bank if you can't pay.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, the document that Drummond is given is apparently signed by William Adair. And it says on the paper, and we quote from what we know about it, that the payments will be well and faithfully made, and Adair would bind myself, my heirs, executors and administrators firmly by these presents, sealed with my seal. So he's basically saying that even if I die, my estate will be good on this debt, and Drummond will certainly be paid. But
I thought there was a but coming.
Of course, it's going to get more complicated than that, isn't it? When Perreaus shares the name of the wealthy guarantor William Adair with Drummond, alarm bells begin to ring for Drummond himself. So much so that he asks his brother to come and take a look at the bond that Perreaus is offering.
So why is it that those alarm bells are ringing? Is William Adair a fake name? Is he a real person?
Yes, he is absolutely a real person, and he is pretty well known in the City of London because he's wealthy, he handles a lot of military contacts, he sits at the heart of the kind of City of London economy, and he is also known to Drummond's bank. But as Drummond said, when he later gives evidence about this interaction with Perreaus, he says, As soon as we saw it, we both expressed a disbelief of its being Mr. Adair's bond and asked the prisoner, Robert Perreaus, spoiler there, if it was Mr. William Adair's, the late agent that lived in Pall Mall. He said yes, it was, and there could be no doubt about it. So the issue that's Perreaus is really facing is that the two brothers at Drummond's Bank had in fact had many personal dealings themselves with Mr. Adair. And looking at this bond, they were really not sure that was his handwriting.
Okay, so it's all starting to look a bit fishy.
Yes, indeed. So Drummond continues when he's giving evidence at the court city of the bond, upon which Robert Perreaus said that Mr. Adair was his particular friend and that there were family connections between them. So, Perreaus is kind of basically saying it's okay. I know you're feeling a bit worried about this, Mr. Drummond, but don't worry, Adair's my mate, and we have a personal connection, and just chill. It's fine. You can give me the money.
In the 18th century, how would you verify this? I mean, there's no kind of ID. How's he going to prove that they're just friends?
Well, firstly, what he tries to do is he kind of goes away for a while and he comes back and he says to Drummond, do you know what? I happened to bump into Mr. Adair in the street and he said to pass on a message that it's okay, that's my bond, please go ahead. Unsurprisingly, this doesn't
that doesn't fly.
This doesn't reassure Mr. Drummond, the banker. And so he and his brother decide to go and actually visit Mr. Adair themselves the next day. And so after a little bit of conversation with Robert Perreaus, they agree to go with Mr. Perreaus to the home of William Adair to put the matter at rest once and for all. Interestingly, Mr. Perreaus says, sure, he's my friend, let's go and sort this out in person.
Okay, so the plot thickens a bit. What happens when they do get to Adair's? Did he confirm, yeah, we're friends, I am the guarantor?
Well, it's all mysterious. And some very strange kind of interactions begin to unfold when they get to the property of Mr. William Adair. So, Ellie, why don't you have a look at his account, Mr. Drummond's account of what actually happened?
Okay, so we've got this here. Mr. Drummond says, upon our entrance, Mr. Adair took me by the hand, but he made a bow to Mr. Perreaus as a person he'd never seen before. I told Mr. Adair I came to him upon a disagreeable subject. I produced the bond and asked him whether this was his signature at the bottom of it. He looked at it and said no, upon which Mr. Robert Perreaus seemed surprised very much, and he said to Mr. Adair, surely, sir, you are jocular. So basically he's saying, I don't know this guy, this isn't my signature. And Perreaus saying, oh, he's just having a laugh with us, don't take him seriously.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very peculiar. So it's almost as though, we encountered each other for the first time and I said, hi, Ellie, how are you? It's so great to see you. I hope you had a good time at the weekend. You're like, I'm sorry, I don't think I have any idea who you are. And so this kind of moment of strange exchange seems to have taken place, almost at the doorway of Mr. Adair's house. In the course of this conversation, this strange exchange between Drummond, Adair and Mr. Robert Perreaus, Mr. Perreaus says, actually, you're right. I had never met you personally, but I understand that you're very closely acquainted with my sister, Mrs. Daniel Perreaus, the wife of the Perreaus brother. Then the group try and get more kind of personal information about what's going on. The Drummonds actually asked to meet Mrs. Perreaus, and this lady turns up. She's elegant and respectable and seems totally calm and in control of things, and said, yes, I did give the bond to Mr. Robert Perreaus. It's originally from me. But she's so calm and contained and sort of just disarmingly subtle that the Drummonds have just left completely baffled. And then the case takes an even stranger twist, actually, because the reason it comes to be a matter of the court is actually not because the Drummonds challenge the bond at all, but Mr. Perreaus the next day takes himself off to the magistrate's office and says he believes himself to have been a victim of a fraud.
Okay, so this is getting very complicated, but let's just focus in for a moment on the three kind of protagonists or anti-heroes, if we can call them that in this case. We've got the two Perreaus brothers and Mrs. Caroline Rudd. So let's start with the twins. They are twins, right? Daniel and Robert. Are they identical?
Yes. So far, we've met Mr. Robert Perreaus, who's the man who's actually handing the bond over. He's a respectable apothecary. He's so far denying any knowledge of anything that's going on. We've heard him talk about his sister, who is Mrs. Daniel Perreaus, also known as Mrs. Caroline Rudd. She's our elegant lady, disarming, charming, unclear how she fits into the story at all. And then behind the scenes, the person who we have intimated about but haven't yet discussed is Robert's twin brother, Daniel. Now, Daniel is reputedly untrustworthy. He's a gambler. He spends money. But they all live quite a fine life on the edges of the West End.
It's interesting, these two identical twins with very different temperaments. It's almost a kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing going on. What else do we know about Caroline?
Well, maybe we should call her Caroline throughout, because when we first meet her in the story, she's known as Mrs. Perreaus. She appears to be the wife of one of the twins, Mr. Daniel Perreaus, our rogue. But in fact, she's also Mrs. Rudd. It appears they're not actually married. She's not married to Daniel Perreaus, she's just his mistress, but they live together as man and wife. She appears to be mother of his children. But as the court case unfolds, she refers to herself throughout as Mrs. Perreaus, wife of Daniel, but the twin brothers refer to her consistently as Mrs. Rudd.
Ooh, so they're kind of distancing themselves from her there.
Indeed they are, yes. So they're denying that kind of close relationship that she is presenting.
And do we know what she was like as a person?
Well, we actually know very little about her as a person because lots of stories seem to be spun around her. And some of these are actually spun by herself in the course of the court case, as we'll see. But we know that she presents as a lady who's well-dressed, polite, respectable. She's described as quite as small and beautiful and elegant, not a kind of intimidating or challenging person at all. Some have suggested that she's had a murky past. She's been married before. Was she possibly a prostitute previously? Often a kind of, aspersion that's cast on women's characters, particularly in court cases. So we don't really know all that much about her, apart from these kind of characterisations which come through in the court case that follows.
So we have this scene unfolding at William Adair's, where it transpires that this bond perhaps is not what it seems. Mm-hmm. Is this the first time that William Adair's name had been used on bonds by the Perreaus or by Caroline Rudd?
No. So it appears that this is a scam or a fraud which they have been perpetuating for quite a long time. It's impossible to know exactly when it started, but it seems as though they have some sort of layering upon layering of borrowing of money, and that at some point they started with one bond signed allegedly by William Adair to get some money, and then to pay off that one they borrowed more money from somebody else or attempted to, and so it continues. So it's almost a kind of pyramid scheme of forgery, which eventually ends up at Drummond's Bank when they're requesting thousands and thousands of pounds. But interestingly, when various witnesses are called to testify in the case regarding the forgery, lots of the acquaintances of Robert Perreaus actually just simply cannot believe that he could have been involved in any such a scam. They regard him as honest, trustworthy, the honest Mr. Perreaus, their apothecary, an upstanding member of the community, a person who could be absolutely trusted upon at all times. It clearly never crossed anybody's mind that there might have been anything more to that person in particular, Robert Perreaus, than met the eye.
And these were even people who'd been given bonds by Perreaus as well.
Yes, it seems to be the case. So one witness is Dr. Thomas Brooke, and he testifies that after asking to borrow some money from him, actually Daniel Perreaus had issued him a bond, also signed by William Adair, for £3,100. And it seems as though the people who were participating in these earlier transactions never doubted the nature of the bond, the nature of the signature, the trustworthiness of the Perreaus brothers, or the fact that these were genuine and proper kind of financial interactions.
It's interesting to me that they were deemed so trustworthy. Does that mean that they were just very good liars?
Possibly. Another character reference was given by a man called Sir Thomas Frankland, who said that Mr. Robert Perreaus had been his apothecary for about 15 or 16 years. Now, Ellie, do you want to read what Frankland had to say about Perreaus' character?
Yes. So Frankland said that I always looked upon him as an honest man, and I thought he was incapable of ever deceiving me at all. My uncle thought him so honest a man that he always called him Honest Perreaus. I mean, he's used the word honest
How
3
many
times in one quote there.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the story that comes over and over again, is this kind of just incredulity that anybody could be so deceiving that, you know, their acquaintances had no suspicions at all that any of these things might have been going on. And, you know, one of the problems that seems to be encountered in the court in particular is that because the Perreaus brothers are identical twins, they dress completely alike, that even some of the witnesses who know them very well can't be completely sure which brother they were speaking to at any particular moment. And that adds another layer of confusion to the case. But it also highlights the ways in which an 18th century financial system operated on a system of trust and credit. There's an awful lot of kind of moments of commercial interaction between people where actually no money changes hands immediately, where people pay off debts later, where there's an anticipation of payment, you know, even 10 years later, perhaps when someone comes into an inheritance. So the whole of the kind of financial infrastructure rests on credit and trustworthiness, which is why this case in particular eventually creates so much public attention, because it seems to go at the very heart of how that system is functioning.
So Hannah, to understand more about the logistics of this case, can you tell us a bit more about bonds and why they were so important in Georgian society?
Well, I suppose one of the ways to think about it is to, you know, understand that in our modern society, in order to borrow money or to have any kind of interaction or sign a contract, it requires lots of layers of identification, formal identification, so something with your address on it, passport, driving licence, whatever. There weren't really any of those formal forms of ID available in the 18th century. So a lot of it was just done on knowing who people were. So who people were in the community, who people were by reputation. There was a lot of financial exchanges that happened based on trust, on credit, on loans, on assurances that money would be forthcoming at some point. And that happens at all layers of society, from an individual person going into a shop, perhaps trying to purchase something. They don't necessarily pay straight away. They might come back and pay a month later, or they might be billed quarterly, to big financial exchanges with banks and things like that. So this whole system of credit and trust and other people guaranteeing other people's payments is really exactly how the whole of the kind of economy operates.
It's so interesting, this importance placed on trust and reputation. So I guess when people broke that trust, it's very significant.
Yes, reputation and also appearance of reputation. So, one of the key elements of this Perreaus case is the ways in which the Perreaus brothers as twins and Caroline appeared to be respectable. They were well dressed, they were well spoken, they lived in nice properties. Why would anyone not trust who they were? And, you can see cases of other 18th century individuals trying to figure out how the system of reputation works. So there's a lovely case of James Boswell, the diarist, he's an aspiring young lawyer. He comes to London for the first time and he really wants to believe that people will see he's a gentleman, that he's a true gentleman. And one of the ways he tests it is he decides to go to a sword maker, a cutler, and he goes to the very best, Mr. Jeffrey's shop. He's cutler to the king, and there's no one better. And he walks into the shop, he says, "Sir, I'd like this sword." Mr. Jeffrey says, "Well, I don't know who you are." And Boswell says, "Oh, well, of course, you're absolutely right to not trust a gentleman, but I am a gentleman." And Mr. Jeffreys looks at him and says, "Well, only a gentleman would say that. So, yes, you can take the sword." And Boswell feels incredibly proud of himself that he's managed to persuade the shopkeeper to hand it over. And so he turns up the next day and says, "Look, I was a gentleman. I've come to pay my bills and you were right to trust me." But it's an interesting example of how much daily interaction was just based on presenting yourself as somebody who will pay, or somebody who's due that kind of product, or somebody who should have it. And so, yes, you can see how that is at the very heart of that kind of social, cultural, but also commercial world.
But presumably that also meant that you could really fake it till you make it if you tried. If you dress the part, if you've got the right voice.
Yes.
you can sell yourself as someone that you're not necessarily.
Yes, and there's some other fantastic stories of fraudsters who do exactly that. They dress as fine gentlemen, they hire a carriage, they appear to have fine lodgings, they even borrow a footman for a day, and they go to shopkeepers and say, I'm coming to an inheritance in 6 months' time, but I need to stock up my property now. And they just, take all of these piles and piles of belongings and then just disappear into thin air. So there's certainly a few other scammers out there as well. But I think that what makes the Perreaus case and Caroline's case so significant, and what we'll see is that it absolutely captures public attention, is the way in which it's sort of done on paper, very, very subtly.
It seems to me as well that there's some really interesting undercurrents in this case of wealth and class and appearance that, if we set aside the fact there was a scam involved for a second, do tell us something interesting about society at the time. How easy was it to move between these different rungs of society?
Yeah. Well, it seems to have begun to fed into perhaps a public concern that there was much more slippery movement between these social levels than people like to think. That the society was not so well policed, actually, that somebody could just turn up, get a house in Golden Square, dress very finely, and basically get an income of thousands and thousands of pounds on the basis of emptiness, nothing. There's nothing really there behind the Perreaus or Caroline to justify that kind of level of lifestyle or expenditure.
But to circle back to scams very quickly, you mentioned a couple there. Were scams something that people were aware of, afraid of at the time?
I think it was a concern because there is a degree of sort of trying to test in the way that the Drummonds, when Mr. Robert Perreaus appears with the bond signed by William Adair, they do test it a bit. How do you know this person? Are you sure that's his signature? I'm not sure it's his signature. So there's a little bit of interchange. But if somebody can bluff that out or has enough other props about them to assuage those concerns, then it seems as though sometimes they can get away with it.
Sounds to me like it's quite a good time to be a scammer.
Yeah, possibly, unless you're caught, and then it's really, really terrible.
So let's return now to the case of Caroline and the Perreaus. What happened when it was brought to trial?
It actually sparks a sensation, and crowds gather, to try and find out, to get news about what's going to happen to these individuals. One newspaper correspondent reported how the case is lately become the topic of conversation from the High Department of State down to the microscopic atmospheres of every petty coffee and porterhouse politician. So as though it's captured, the attention of society from the very highest to the very lowest. All of society is waiting to see what's going to happen.
It's a focus of national interest then.
Yes, it is. It's absolutely, the newspapers are covering every tiny scrap of detail, partly because of the protagonists, they're amazing, fascinating, curious characters, but also because the stakes are really, really high. Forging bonds was a capital offence, and if these individuals were found guilty, then they were highly likely to be sentenced to death.
And that's interesting because obviously today forgery would carry a much lesser sentence. Is that because of this importance of trust in the system of economics that we talked about before, do you think?
Yes, because, so much depends on that system of trust. And if that is challenged in some way, then it appears to undermine so much of how 18th century society operates. And really at the heart of it is a belief that a person's property is of utmost importance and sacrosanct, that so much of the way in which 18th century society understands itself is on the basis of property. Who has the right to vote? Who has the right to be an MP? Laws are enshrined to protect people's property from small items against theft to, huge estates through primogeniture. If somebody is pretending to have property that they don't, or laying claim to somebody else's property, which is basically what the Perreaus and Caroline Rudd are doing by using William Adair's name. The bond said, even if I die, it will come from my estate. They are making a claim to Adair's property that's not theirs. They are putting at risk his status, his financial security, and their own property is empty. It's not real. It's a pretense. And so that causes a huge amount of disruption to so many ways in which the 18th century culture and economy operates.
So it's some serious high-stakes stuff. You mentioned that the characters themselves were also very much of interest to the public. How so?
Well, as we've already described them, they have these sort of three very different personalities, and the stories of these personalities shift with almost each moment of the court case unfolding. So for a while, Mrs. Perreaus, Mrs. Rudd, Caroline, we need to call her, presents herself as genteel and respectable, but then she presents herself as helpless, as though she's been forced into this terrible role, these terrible crimes by these awful, violent, vile brothers who've stolen her money and have almost held her hostage and forced her to do things she never wanted to do. But, we can see that there's a great interest in who these individuals are and what they look like, because at the time of the trial there's a huge number of kind of printed portraits that are circulated of the accused that would show the public exactly who these people were. So we've got some with us here, Ellie. Do you want to take a look and describe them for us?
Okay, so we've got two prints. One is of the Perreaus twins and one is of Caroline, and both of them actually are quite somber, I'd say. The image of the twins, I mean, they've made it very clear that they're twins. Presumably that was something that people were fascinated by.
Yeah, they do seem to have been really interested in it. And I think it's the really identical nature of these two men as well. And they dress alike. They have similar mannerisms. It's obviously very difficult to tell them apart. And again, that just adds to this layer of complexity about who is the real person. If you can have two of the same person, then what does that do for the trial? It just becomes, very complicated, really.
And then in the picture of Caroline, she's got this, as you say, respectable look, this high hair, a nice hat on, but she does look very pleading. She looks quite helpless. She looks innocent. She doesn't look defiant in this image, does she?
No, and it seems as though from the kind of narratives that come out of the courtroom, whether or not they're true or not, we can never really say, but she definitely presents herself as pleading and helpless, and initially it appears that her pleas for mercy and support and guidance work, because at the first stage of these proceedings, basically the magistrate takes pity on her and says that she shouldn't be tried for the crime at all, but she should stand as witness testimony to these terrible deeds that have been done to her and to society by these Perreaus twins.
But did the twins have any comeback? Do they challenge her version of events?
Absolutely. So they do. They come back very strongly, saying that she is the architect of the crime, that she, was the planner, the organizer, that she duped them, that she led them, that she's a dangerous woman, that nobody should trust her appearances because actually she's a devious criminal mastermind who has kind of led these poor two gentlemen astray. So, Ellie, do you want to find out a bit more about what the Perreaus brothers were saying about Caroline? And we have this quote here from Daniel, if you'd like to take a look.
So this is the man who she's been sharing life with, living as man and wife with, and clearly now he's turned on her. He says, "My lord, I received the bond from Mrs. Rudd as a true bond of Mr. William Adair's. I did really believe it to be a genuine, authentic and valid bond, and I solemnly protest by all my hopes of happiness here and hereafter, so villainous an intention of it defrauding any man of his property never entered my mind." So he's basically saying, wasn't me, governor. We had no idea. It was all Caroline.
Yes. He's basically saying we absolutely believe Caroline. Caroline said that she was, very well acquainted with Mr. William Adair, that I think at one point she said to them that they're family relations or something like that. And the Perreaus brothers just claimed that they never doubted it. They never doubted her access to Mr. Adair's reputation or his money or anything. Their case is that they believed her, that they are naive, innocent men who were duped and corrupted by a devious, scheming woman. But Caroline, in turn, gives a completely different counter-narrative. She says she's the one that's been led astray. She even acknowledges that she did create these bonds by William Adair at some point, but rather than presenting that as the act of a criminal mastermind, she presents that as the act of a helpless woman who was forced into it at knife point by these terrible criminal twin brothers.
So we have these two vastly different versions of events. Hannah, who do you think we should believe, and do you think we can get any kind of sense of truth here?
I think it's baffling and confusing, and you can see why it captured a public interest and an imagination, because almost as though somebody begins to feel they have a sense of one character, that idea of the character just disappears between our fingers, and then this other character appears. So, Caroline Rudd appears first. Is she helpless? Has she been, kind of held captive by these men? It's possible, isn't it? But then also, the way in which she presents herself when she first meets the drummer, she seems so in control of the narrative and so successful in presenting her case that you sort of really think she probably did it. And, as the case unfolds, she becomes incredibly good at PR. Before the days of social media, she harnesses the newspapers to support her campaign, and she kind of places advertisements saying that she will tell her story the next week in this particular newspaper, and then her side of the story comes to the fore. And because I think there's just one of her, it becomes possible for her to write her narrative in a particular way. But I think for the Perreaus brothers, because they stick together so tightly, because they are twins, because they seem, particularly in the court case, to be absolutely committed to coming together as the two of them as a team, it becomes impossible to distinguish between them. And so they have less control, I think, of their narrative because of that. This kind of twin factor really is difficult for them to manage, because a court cannot decide if it's one brother or the other. So they kind of both have to be guilty or they both have to be innocent.
Yeah, and I guess we'll probably never be able to quite unpick how culpable each person involved was. But who ultimately came out on top in the courtroom? From what you've told me there, it sounds like it might have been Caroline.
Yeah, so Caroline does manage to escape really without a guilty verdict, even though she is initially let off and then is called as witness. And then there's a bit of a dramatic twist, because actually at that court case, the judge decides she doesn't seem very innocent at all, and she should be held to trial as well for the crime. So then she does have a criminal case to answer to, but she manages somehow to come through all of that and is found not guilty, whereas the Perreaus brothers are found guilty of handling the forged bond. They're not found guilty of actually creating it, but they are found guilty of handling it, of uttering it, and with that guilty sentence comes a capital punishment.
And was that death sentence seen through?
Yes, it was. And, the Perreaus brothers are hanged at the gallows in matching clothes, holding hands, actually, until the last. And one of the things that is particularly moving and affecting about the story, which, seems so interesting and dramatic and kind of salacious in its telling, we have to remember that at that final moment, these two men did die at the gallows, and they protested their innocence until the very last.
So reflecting on this case, Hannah, why do you think that Caroline was ultimately acquitted while the Perreaus were hanged? I mean, was gender an element at play there, or do you think she just told a better story in court?
Honestly, Ellie, my mind starts boggling when I try and pin it down. Even from the perspective of a historian, having these documents with a distance, between us, I still find it almost impossible to get a sense of what the truth of the story is, or why particular events unfolded as they did. I mean, there does seem to be some degree of gendered element behind it, in that, for instance, the Drummonds in particular seem to have found it impossible to believe that this slight, well-dressed woman who presented herself at the moment in which they were challenging the bond could be a criminal. How could that possibly be the case? They seem to be unable to process that idea that she could be the architect of such a complicated scheme to do with money and finance and reputation and manipulation, when she was just this lovely lady in a dress. And so there is an element of that, certainly, that's going on. She absolutely seems to have told a cracker of a story and been compelling and believable and, presumably manipulative, and that she shifts her story around a number of different times and seems to get away with it. But also there's just a kind of society fascination with it, a sort of trial by media almost that happens around this case, which might feel kind of familiar to us for certain like celebrity modern court cases today, where the public are hungry for details, the newspapers are pumping out information, they're almost sort of making decisions about the case before anyone's even given witness testimonies in court. And there's a social interest in it, I think, because as we've discussed, it seems to get to the heart of how this society operates. But also the timing of the trial is potentially important. It's in the 1770s. There's a lot of other things going on in Britain and the world at the time. There's a sense of a sort of tumbling crisis in those decades anyway. And so that's possibly also one of the reasons that is behind this generation of news around it, in that it feeds into other concerns that it's a time of change, a time of uncertainty. It's the time of the revolution in America. Britain's identity, its national identity, people's place in the world seems to be challenged. And there's this wonderful comprehensive book that's been written about this trial by historians Donna Andrew and Randall McGowan. And in the introduction, they talk about how they just thought it was an interesting case, and it became this whole book, as you can see, because the story just unfolds and unfolds and there's more and more layers to it. But one of the things that they suggest is that the case commanded public attention because it seemed to represent this sense of crisis at the time, that the protagonists involved in the case had apparent respectability, but was that respectability just a veneer that was masking a darker, more criminal self? And there was a sort of fear that these characters represented something very destabilising, something very uncertain about contemporary society itself, where all of these ideas of respectability, of honesty, of trust and credit were just a mask. It was all a fraud, and that there was a corrupt and disordered society behind it that was perhaps about to unravel.
What do you think that this scandal in particular reveals about the Georgian age?
What doesn't it reveal? It's everything. It tells us about how the law functions, how media functions, how there's a kind of interest in incredible stories and storytelling, and there's an appetite for drama, for news and fiction. There's a kind of just preoccupation with how the fabric of society functions. So are people who they say they are? And if they're not, what does that mean? Not just for the people standing trial in the court or the people trying to judge whether or not a crime has been committed, but for everybody. If you can't trust the apothecary that you've known for 10 years or 15 years, and he's not the man who says he is, if you meet a woman in fine clothing and she's deeply, deeply untrustworthy, what does that mean?